Hello, and good evening, and welcome to the Comics Experience Graphic Novel of the Month Club for the month of October 2020. The year's almost over, thank God. We're 13 days from the election, by the way, which just to sink this in the historical record of when things are happening. I like doing that. Thank you for tuning in, or as you tune in. We've got a great book this month. The book is Displacement. It is a new original graphic novel, and our author is Kiku Hughes, who's right there. Hello, Kiku.
Hi.
Am I pronouncing that correctly?
Perfect.
Okay, just you never know.
Yeah.
Very good. You're doing well tonight?
Yeah, as well as I can. As you said, it is 2020, so the standards have shifted from other years. But yeah, doing fine.
Yeah. Well, you have a book out this year. That makes it a good year, right?
Well, I would. It's exciting on that front. Yeah, I would trade a few things if it meant some other things didn't happen. But
Right. Yeah. Well, we love the book a lot. My first question, and this is always my first question. I love this question. Why comics? Of all the things you could be doing, of all the ways you can tell a story, of anything you could be doing, what is it about comics that attracted you and made you want to do a graphic novel?
Well, from a very personal perspective, comics was a very natural sort of fit for me. I was actually an English major in college, so I did a lot of reading and sort of like understanding storytelling, but I also liked to draw, and it took me much longer than it should have to realize how those two things could sort of combine. But when I was in college, sort of just getting out of college and trying to figure out what I was going to do with my life, I started reading a lot of webcomics that were really interesting, really cool. There was Oh Human Star by Blue Delaquanti. There was F-Skin by Spare Monster. And these were really interesting comics that were being told by people that I didn't think really had voices in the publishing industry a lot of the times, but they were self-publishing and they were able to get their art out there because comics is so accessible, I think, to a wide audience. So the combination of that plus the internet was allowing a lot of marginalized creators to have their voices heard in ways that I felt like I wasn't seeing other places. So that was sort of my initial interest in comics. And in terms of comics as it relates to Japanese American incarceration, which Displacement is about, is a story essentially about Japanese American incarceration. Yeah. It also is an interesting sort of like historical tie to visual storytelling, because one of my main sort of research items was a book called Citizen 13660 by Mina Ikubo. And it is a visual illustrated diary that she kept while imprisoned in Tamparan and Topaz, which were the same camps that my grandmother was taken to. So she kept illustrated history of what was happening to her and what she was experiencing in a way that wasn't exactly comics, but it also was sort of setting the stage for this story to be told through illustration, which is kind of cool.
Sure. No, that's really interesting. You said you were in an English program, so for prose writing, you were studying?
Oh, reading. I wasn't even writing.
Oh, interesting. Oh, that's very interesting. Okay. Just because my son's about to go to college, I sort of have to ask this question. What did you think your job would be after college? Having an English reading degree.
Oh yeah, it varied. At first, I thought maybe I would want to go into journalism.
Okay.
But I feel like I kind of dodged a bullet there. Much respect to journalists now. I know it's a really hard job, especially now. It seems very stressful in the modern era. And I knew, the only thing I really knew was that I didn't want to be a teacher, which is what basically everyone told me was my inevitable fate. So I wasn't sure exactly what I was going to do. I just knew that I enjoyed reading and talking about books.
Okay. So did you have any formal art training at all?
I mean, I took classes in school. But I think a lot of it was really just just sort of doing it for fun, because it was fun because it wasn't school for a lot of it. So
Yeah, your art is surprisingly polished for
Oh,
someone
thank
who
you.
doesn't have a ton of training. I would have to say.
Thanks.
Where did you pick up the chops to tell stories visually? Do you know what I mean? Because it's a very specific kind of a skill.
Yeah, I don't, I think actually, and I don't want to, there's still a lot that I have to learn about that, and I'm trying to
Sure.
study as I go. But definitely reading a lot helps immensely, I think. Reading comics is a big part of it. Starting out sort of looking at the web comics that were doing such interesting things with, paneling. And because it's on the web, a lot of them were able to sort of experiment more with that kind of paneling and breaking borders and things like that. You don't necessarily have the limitations of being on a page. And I think, I think having an English literature background helped in a way of sort of breaking down narratives, kind of piecemeal in a way where you're constructing or you're figuring out the narrative structure. And I think that helps you sort of figure out how things are going to look visually too when it comes to designing what your comic is going to look like.
Sure.
But I don't know. I haven't really thought about that question too much.
Yeah, no, I mean whatever the answer is the correct answer. I wasn't looking for one answer or another. I'm just always curious about how people come to this point. When you were studying English, were there any comics specific classes that you took in terms of graphic novels, or sort of a survey of graphic novels or specific writers?
No, actually, and I really wish that I had, because when I was, in college, I didn't yet even really realize that comics was such a wide, vast, like genre.
Yeah,
And I think that is true for a lot of people my age and older. And I think it's changing now, which is really cool to see. That I think a lot of college classes and high school classes are viewing comics as a more legitimate literature form,
sure.
which is great because there's obviously comics like Persepolis, which I read pretty young. That was sort of one of those groundbreaking comics that really pushed the genre into the more mainstream, serious, I guess, circles. I don't know. But other than that, yeah, it was mostly just novels and prose.
So I would make the general, not particularly serious argument that the way that stories are told in prose is very different than they're told in comics, because in comics you don't want to have a lot of tell, right? Because everything's kind of show in comics, and if anything, dialogue draws the story along further than caption and narration does. So since your training was in prose, what was it like making that jump to doing a comic?
Yeah, and I think Displacement is such an unique first book, I think, for me, because it did rely a lot on narration, because there was so much context that I needed to give a lot of the times, making sure that people sort of understood what was happening in the camp in ways that you can't necessarily always say in dialogue, especially since people in camp didn't necessarily have that information themselves at the time. So I did rely a lot on narration and things like that for Displacement, more so than any another comic might, if it didn't have that sort of historical part of it. But yeah, I think definitely the show not tell thing was a big hurdle for me at first, especially since so much visual information about the camps themselves is kind of hard to access. There's not a lot of like visual records because people weren't allowed to bring cameras into camp. So, even the photos that we do have were often very filtered through, what was allowed to be seen at the time by the government. So it was an interesting exercise in sort of navigating that difficulty of figuring out, what did things look like, how much detail to put in, the historical accuracy of what I was drawing was a big issue. And maybe even having that to focus on, having that, worry, how am I going to draw this camp? How am I going to draw this barrack room, etc. Kind of helped me, stay grounded in the visual rather than narration, I guess.
Sure. The back of the book notes that your previous work had just been anthologies, like short stories and things like that. I'm assuming, you can correct me if I'm wrong, because I actually haven't encountered any of these works. But we're talking about probably stories that are 20 pages or less. Is that probably right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So was it a big jump to do a 276, 78 page book?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the longest comic I had made before this was about 32 pages.
Okay.
Yeah, so this one definitely, it was a very different experience. And, like day by day, it feels the same. And it helps to have the whole thing thumbnailed, of course, so it's a little bit more manageable. But yeah, this is definitely by far the longest project I've ever been a part of. And yeah, it took a long time.
Yeah. How long did it take you from conception, would you say, to complete the book?
It took about 4 years.
Okay.
And I know that because I started really thinking about it in earnest during the 2016 election. So it's crazy. It took about an entire presidential period.
Yeah. So tell me where your inspiration to do the story came from.
Yeah, so definitely the 2016 election was a big motivating factor. And I mentioned, I have a few quotes in Displacement that came directly from, the Trump campaign during the election and soon after inauguration. And the reason for that is, the rhetoric that was being used in the 2016 election was so reminiscent of a lot of the fear-mongering, the sort of racist fear-mongering that was happening, to Japanese Americans during World War II. And I think not only my family, but plenty of other Japanese Americans, made this connection. And in the wake of the inauguration and of the presidency, there was like a renewed push in the Japanese American community to really be more outspoken about incarceration, about the lasting effects of Japanese American incarceration, and sort of to be there to remind people, this is something that history books have widely condemned, Japanese American incarceration, and yet it's happening again. And as I did more research and as I sort of got more involved in activism over the last 4 years, these kinds of holding camps that are happening at the border, these kinds of detention centers, didn't start with Trump, and I realize that now. But I do think that his sort of level of vitriol kind of galvanized at least the community, Japanese American community, to speak more openly and more loudly about what happened.
Yeah. Do you worry at all that that the references to Trump will end up dating the work?
I think that is an interesting question that I have been asked, and I realized when I was thinking about it, I think it is in itself a historical book. It is a book about a history of Japanese American, community since World War II. And I really do think that the Trump presidency specifically has become a part of Japanese American history because of the way that Japanese Americans specifically have come together and become more vocal during this time.
Yeah.
So in that way, I think even if it dates it, I think that is still makes it part of a larger historical graphic novel.
Absolutely. Sure. Yeah, no, absolutely. I was just wondering, it just came to me as a stray thought.
No,
Yeah. So you started conceiving of the book at the because of Trump's rhetoric. and well, eventually his actions as well. What was your interest in the incarceration camps up to that point? What was your knowledge up to that point?
Yeah, I had grown up, and I can't even remember the first time I heard about camp, because as long as I can remember, I've known about this relationship that our family had with camp, that my grandmother had been taken to incarceration camps. And I know I had done some like independent study of it in school, because we weren't taught a whole lot about it in school. But I knew so very little about the actual like facts of incarceration. I had very vague sort of history textbook understandings of it. And actually one of the first sort of things that got me really thinking about how I would write the book is a talk that I went to at the Seattle Public Library, either just after the election or just before, that was specifically about Japanese American incarceration and sort of lasting effects of it. And that was the first time I had really thought about, what is my relationship to what happened? How did incarceration affect future generations? How is it more than just a moment in history, but it actually like, how did it leave sort of these marks and scars on a community? And that really got me thinking sort of about, these big acts of racial trauma that we enact on communities and what it does further down the line. So that kind of was what inspired me to look more into camp and into, that concept.
Okay, so how did you draw the line from sort of this early interest in the topic to doing a whole book about it, and then specifically to make that a graphic novel?
Yeah, I think, as I said, like I think a lot of Japanese Americans were feeling like we need to do something, we need to say something during the 2016 election and during the Trump presidency. And because I had been sort of making short comics and things before that, I think that's sort of where my I need to do something sort of manifested. Become like a need to have these stories out in the world, and this is my medium already, so that I guess is how I channeled that kind of frustration and helpless feeling of I need to do something.
Yeah. No, I can see that. I guess what I'm asking is sort of more the technical question of how did you make the jump to actually putting together a proposal for a 275-page book? Because it's a big step, right? To go from 30 pages at the most, many, not mini comics, but in anthologies or whatever, to doing a big book like this, and then selling it to a major publisher. I'm always endlessly fascinated by this part of the process.
Yeah, I wish I had more insight, because I don't really know about my mindset at the time. I guess it was just naivety that I thought that, might as well try and email it around and see what people think. So
what kind of a pitch were you emailing around?
At that time, it was definitely the pitch was a time travel sort of narrative about Japanese American incarceration. And that was sort of the main crux of it, that I wanted it to be a story about generational trauma, about the lasting effects of incarceration, and using time travel as a means of sort of putting a modern audience into that space.
Yeah. Okay. So let's follow up on that thread then. Why time travel? Why was that a thing that you centered on in the initial part of it?
Yeah. So back to the sort of me being an English major, one of the books that was really transformative for me was Octavia Butler's Kindred, which I reference in the book. And in Kindred, for those of you who haven't read it, a Black American in the 70s, I believe, is transported back to antebellum South, to a plantation that her ancestors, I think her great-great-grandmother, was a slave on. And she has to sort of navigate that world that she's unfamiliar with, but has this deep historical relationship to. And her character is pulled back in time against her will. And so Octavia Butler's work, who was also a Seattleite, was really inspiring because it showed the way that classical sci-fi tropes like time travel, like alien abduction, can be used as these devices that tell a broader, more human story, I guess. Sure. And so it was a really good way of showing generational trauma and the impact, like intergenerational impact of these things. And yeah, what I ended up doing with Displacement was a little bit different because it turns out that it's memory travel rather than time travel. And that choice was because there was so many things that I knew that I would never be able to have the pure facts on about incarceration, partially because I'd never met my grandmother. She died before I was born. So there are plenty of things that were lost when she died that I'd never be able to ask her. And there are also just details about camp that are, classified by the government or things that were just never recorded. So there was so much distance between what I could actually know about camp and yet what the effects on my community were, that memory felt more authentic almost than fact.
Yeah. I thought it was a very interesting choice to make too, where the time traveler was you. That's not usually what you see in a time travel story. Usually it's a third person to keep some professional distance or whatever. I don't know the right way to say that. But it was an interesting choice, I thought, to bring you in.
Thanks. Yeah, it's a very personal story. And I felt like I wanted it to be that way, to really make it, I guess, humanize the story itself. I think some people, when they read a book and they see that it's, based on real people, that they're put a face to this story, I guess, can help sort of contextualize it and make it seem real.
Yeah. No, I can see that. Absolutely. Jordan tells me we've got a couple of questions coming in already. If you're watching this at home and you have a question about the book for Kiku, or possibly about the camps or about anything really, let's put it in the comments and we will vet them and see what's going on. What do you got, Jordan? Pudrigo is our best question asker. He always asks great questions every week. It's great. What were the specific challenges / opportunities from being both author and character?
Oh yeah, I think it was definitely hard to create a voice for my character that felt both authentic and also sort of allowed for a character arc, I guess. So I think, and also because my character is 16 versus me, who's 29, putting myself in the shoes of, my own teenage self, not always a comfortable experience being a teenager. So I think, yeah, sort of creating a fictionalized version of myself that felt authentic, but also had enough of a, I guess, fictional aspect to it that it wasn't boring, I guess, because I'm not that interesting.
Look, well, you made a book, so you must be at least somewhat interesting.
I think part of it also was that I really wanted to make my character a little bit less engaged with politics and with her surroundings than I truly am, in order to sort of allow her that growth of finding out why things are important,
I'd follow up that question with, isn't there some sort of a creative dissonance about writing a fictionalized version of yourself? Because obviously you didn't go back in time when you were 16. Or go back in memory when you were 16. At least I don't think that you did. Right? But isn't there a dissonance in creating under those circumstances?
There is, but I think even more than that, because I was treating my character as very much a character, which wasn't a problem because it was a representation of me. I think the harder part was creating my family, creating the character of my mom and of my grandmother, which, you know, felt weirder because it wasn't just me on the line, it was them, you know?
Sure.
And especially with my grandmother, my great grandparents, I realized that it was going to be almost impossible to create an authentic voice for them when I had never met them. And yet, you know, my mom and my aunts and uncle had met my grandmother. So I was like, oh no, I'm going to mess this up, and then they're going to read it and be offended.
Yeah.
So I did make the eventual creative choice of not allowing my character to talk to my grandmother in the book, because it felt almost disrespectful. And it was also a reflection of sort of these things that we can never get. We can never get these kinds of experiences back. But yeah, so I think creating my own character, fictionalized version of myself, was the easiest part. The hardest part was everyone else.
Sure. So it was a very interesting choice too, that you didn't actually interact with your grandmother or your great grandparents, and yet they permeate the story. It's actually really a kind of a fascinating choice. I wonder though, with your mom, did you go over her scenes with her? Did you write them together maybe, or like you did the draft and like, what do you think, mom? And she's like, I would never say that. Or
I actually I didn't show it to her until it was already in production, basically.
okay.
Because
Okay.
I was nervous, and it was a little awkward. My mom is so supportive and she's so great, so I knew it wouldn't be a problem, but I was still kind of worried about it. But yeah, it was interesting because I think the way that my character talks to my mom in the book is very openly about these sort of really big issues and big traumatic moments, which is not necessarily how we talk in real life.
Sure.
As shown by example, that I didn't show her the book until it was already gone to print. So,
Oh, that's funny.
but yeah, she's been great though. She's been very sweet.
So she ended up liking what you wrote, or the way that you represented her.
At least that's what she said. So
Okay. All right. Yeah, moms, you can't ever tell for sure.
yeah.
That's true. Jordan, do we have another question? Yes, we do. Tank Hughes, hello. I like that the book is broken into 11 chapters, which mark the passage of time, even when her life in the camps doesn't change that much. When did you decide to break the story up like that? Good eye.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so there's 11 chapters, and there's also like 4 distinct sections that sort of plot the characters' travel from, you know, the present in San Francisco and Seattle to the past in Tamfred, which was still San Francisco-ish, but and Topaz, which was in Utah, and then to the sort of semi-past, which was in New York, and then back to the present. And so, yeah, those were the main categories I sort of organized the book into: the periods of my grandmother's life, specifically San Francisco, camp in Utah, New York, and then onto the modern era with her, you know, descendants. And so from there, yeah, the chapters sort of broke down more individually about certain specific events. And these events, for example, like one of the main stories that I remember from growing up was the murder of James Wakasa by one of the camp guards, which, you know, takes up kind of a chapter, the murder and then the aftermath. And that is an example of these sorts of moments in time that were so impactful, I think, on my grandmother and on people in camp, that even though camp was so taboo to talk about for such a long time, these things still get passed down. So it was a story that I remember hearing growing up, and I thought, these are the important moments. These are going to be the sort of tent poles, the structural foundation of the story, because I know these are the things that were important enough to pass down stories to my generation.
Yeah. The American knowledge and understanding and being taught about the camps is very, very minor. if at all. I don't know that I ever encountered it as a student. I mean, I'm a little older than you. I'm 52. But I don't know that I ever encountered it as a student. I don't think I encountered it until like a Roy Thomas Justice Society comic book, which is the superheroes from the 1940s, right? They had they got to 1942 and then they had to deal with it in the storyline, and that was like the first I'd ever heard of it. But it's like Americans aren't really taught about it at all, and to the extent that we're taught about it very benignly, I suppose.
Yeah, and even the term, so I grew up with the term internment camp, and I discussed this in the book a little bit. I don't remember exactly if it's in the afterword or what, but I grew up with internment camp. At the time of the camps, they were called evacuation camps, as though to imply that they were just escorting the Japanese Americans to safety somewhere. And so that terminology was used, and then internment camp was used. And in the modern era, it's sort of being phased out to be replaced by incarceration camp or American concentration camp. So even the terminology that is used has been, designed basically to sort of pacify the situation, and make it seem, nice.
Yeah, I mean, it's horrifying, and it's a horrifying stain in the modern, like slavery is horrible, but it's really historical in my mind, whereas the incarceration of the Japanese it's within not quite my lifetime, but within my parents' lifetime, which makes it much less historical to me than it's a real thing. I don't know. And it's odd to me that we just sort of gloss over it so easily.
Yeah, it is interesting though. I think the same thing can be said about slavery too, right? I think there's a very purposeful choice in America to make it seem like something that is so ancient that it's, barely worth thinking about because it happened so long ago. But that is, again, a manufactured feeling in order to distance us from, the realities of what this country has done. We're a young country. It happened, pretty recently in terms of how old this country is.
Yeah, no, I mean, it was really only 80 years ago, which is not that long ago. There are still people alive today who were there. It's kind of crazy. In the research that you've done, do you understand at all what the American government was thinking? And I don't just mean for the incarceration of the Japanese, but it's so narrowcast to just the West Coast, right? Like from Los Angeles up. It seems so kind of incredibly arbitrary to me. Not that these kinds of things aren't arbitrary to begin with, but if we were thought that the Japanese were spies and that we should round them up, like, why did we think we should only do it for like 5 states? I don't really get it.
Yeah. So what's interesting is the more that you look into it, the more arbitrary and nonsensical it seems. Because, for instance, Hawaii, is even closer to Japan. It's actually relatively close. That's why, Pearl Harbor was the target. But Japanese Americans were such a huge population in Hawaii that they weren't widely rounded up like they were on the mainland. They sort of tried to pick out people that they thought would be most likely to be spies. But other than that, Hawaii, which is the closest part of America to Japan, didn't have these mass roundups of Japanese Americans. What it turned out, I think, and this is my theory, I don't know if the government would necessarily admit to this, but I mention in the first part of the book that takes place, the first displacement where Kiku is transported back to the 20s, or 30s, when in San Francisco, there's a sign that's from the Native Sons of the Golden West, which is an organization that was basically a white supremacist organization in California. And they, even back in the 30s, before World War II was really starting, there were signs that were saying, we want Japs out of our schools, we want Japs out of our neighborhood.
Right.
And the issue really became one of economics. There were people in California and throughout the West Coast that were worried about Japanese businesses, Japanese American-owned businesses and farms creating economic pressure and having more success than their white counterparts. So a huge part of it was economics, which is, I think, true for what's happening now too. A lot of the racist fear-mongering is created as a means of disenfranchising and taking economic power away from a minority group.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And it's not like California, hadn't had quite a long history of doing things like that. I mean, you look at Randall Hearst, and what the Hearst newspapers did. They invented yellow journalism, and the reason that marijuana is for 30 or 50 years, whatever it was thought of so poorly, was because of the way the Hearst would write these stories about how the Mexicans were. It's just insane. When you think about it, I don't understand. I don't understand mankind sometimes. I wish I got it.
A mood for 2020 and for
yeah.
and for the country.
Crazy. Are there any other questions, Jordan? We're good. Okay. All right. So I will keep questioning then. Where was I going to go with this? So you, why did you start in San Francisco in particular? Is it because your grandmother's story started in San Francisco?
Yeah. And I think it also, the first sort of chunk of the book is based on a real story of my mom and I trying to find the building that, or the sort of row house that my grandmother had been raised in San Francisco, only to find that it had been demolished and was now a mall, which felt like such a perfect, metaphor for trying to find your history, especially uniquely in America. I think, there's so many layers to it. The way that we kind of tear down history and also repackage it and commodify it, I think is very uniquely American. And being Japanese American, I think I grew up in a time when, anime was really first starting to get very popular in America. And I used to hate anime because people would always ask me, "Oh, you must be a big anime fan, or are you drawing manga?" And I was like, "No, I'm not." So the way that sort of Japanese things went from being so vilified in the 40s and 50s, and then even again sort of briefly in the 80s and 90s because of economic tensions, and then became so like commodified and fetishized when I was growing up, it just felt very appropriate to have sort of that building be demolished and replaced by a mall.
Yeah. No, it's interesting too, in that it's not merely that it's been replaced by a mall, but it's a mall about Japan. It's ostensibly about the Japanese culture, and there's certainly Japanese businesses in there, like from Japan businesses. Mm-hmm. But it's interesting that they've kind of built up an edifice around this thing that they ended up destroying the neighborhood.
Right.
It's an interesting amount of history, because I was reading a bit of it today before I came in, because I wanted to be at least a little bit prepared for this. The neighborhood of Japantown was a pretty substantial neighborhood. There was like 5,000 to 10,000 people living in there. in kind of like a 6 to 8 block radius. And they removed all those people from their homes, and those people lost their homes as a result in many cases. Then the African Americans who were returning from World War II, because of all the shipyards in the Bay Area, after the war was over, they couldn't get jobs anymore because they could work in the shipyards. They were good enough to work in the shipyards, but we don't want them in our regular jobs, because San Francisco was a very racist town in the 40s and the 50s. And so all the African Americans were moving into these Japanese homes, but because they hadn't been cared for 3 or 4 years, it was kind of slum-like. And so it was decided that the best thing to do was to tear it all down to revitalize it. And the Fillmore area on the other side of Geary Street from Japantown was basically the Harlem of the West Coast. I mean, it was a thriving community. And then the redevelopment in the 1970s, which is when Japantown Mall was built, basically annihilated that culture too. So this action of putting the Japanese Americans in the camps not just ruined one culture or subculture, I suppose, but two at the same time. Not at the same time, but a decade, 2 decades apart. It's kind of crazy when you think about it and you lay it out like that these are the dominoes that caused these things to happen. And so much bad came out of this for no logical reason, really.
Yeah, I mean, it is really just, the cult of white supremacy is harmful to so much more than what they initially are trying to attack. It's always, it is truly mind-boggling. I didn't know that whole history, actually, so thank you.
Sure.
That's fascinating. And I'm sure if you look at any major city, you see a very similar story. Like Central Park, beautiful park now raised down an entire Black neighborhood because that was what was considered, expendable.
Yeah. Do you know how many other Japantowns are there in the United States? There's not very many, right? There's only 2 or 3 others.
I mean, I think there are. There's definitely Portland did have one, I believe. I'm not sure about now. Seattle, we have what's called the International District, which used to have a thriving Japantown, and now it's much more Pan-Asian. And LA, of course.
Jordan is giving me the note that there are 3, in fact.
Oh, okay.
LA, San Jose, and San Francisco are the only official ones.
Oh, yeah. I think a lot of others sort of melded into Chinatown.
Right.
There was sort of that merger of culture as well, because a lot of Chinese immigrants and families took over Japanese businesses when Japanese people were taken away. So
yeah. Let's talk about, the book talks about it a lot, but let's maybe talk about it verbally, about the long-term impacts that you see on your culture as a result of this.
Yeah, one of the big things that I sort of realized when researching for Displacement was there are very specific reasons that I had never felt Japanese growing up. I mean, obviously, I'm mixed. I'm half white, half Japanese American. So, and I'm fairly white passing. So there was that distance created. But also, my family didn't do a lot of Japanese culture things. We went to Bonadori sometimes. But other than that, there wasn't a lot of, and we don't speak Japanese at all. And I had always felt kind of like, okay, well, that's just how it is. But researching and sort of thinking about displacement, I realized the very conscious choices that led to it. There was a very specific choice from a lot of people coming out of camp not to engage in Japanese cultural practices anymore. Or if they do, to sort of really tone it down, not to speak Japanese, not to participate in, Buddhist or Shinto festivals, etc. And so like that conscious choice was so interesting to me as a survival mechanism, because I had a complicated relationship with it growing up. At first I was, I rejected some things like anime and things like that because I didn't want it. It felt stereotypical, but then I was kind of resentful that I'd never learned the language, and I was like, oh, why didn't you teach me? And it sort of realized that these sort of acts of survival have happened to so many immigrant groups in the United States that because there's so much pressure on people in the United States to become this sort of homogenous group, even though we try to pretend that we're not pressuring people to do that, but of course you are. It really sort of flattens out everything and it removes so much color from the country that so that was one intergenerational impact of camp, I think, is losing a lot of connection to the culture, to the language, and to that history, because now there's so many things like notes that my great grandfather left. They're all written in Japanese. Nobody knows what they're like. We can't read them at all. So it really does create this stark cutoff of later generations from their context.
I particularly the notion that in the camps the people who were there were not allowed to speak Japanese at all, and that is a habit
various,
that they took home with them. Like, well, I'm somehow not a loyal American or something if I speak a language that I know, so we won't speak it, and we won't teach our children it, and we'll erase our culture to try to assimilate, and that's really scary, and that's something that I don't know that we've necessarily seen in other oppressed cultures in the United States necessarily.
I think I think whenever there is a culture that is deemed scary, there becomes a societal pressure to assimilate in that way. You hear of stories of people, after 9/11 who had people attacked because they were speaking Arabic, or even perceived to be speaking Arabic. It might not have even been Arabic, but people didn't know. And even examples like with AAVE, African American Vernacular English, being discriminated in hiring practices because people don't speak standard American English. So I think there's various ways that these pressures do mount to create the same. This was just like a very concentrated event.
Understood. But it's general. What I'm trying to say is that it seems to me that it's generally not from inside that culture. It's usually something that's put on you from the outside. But I'll tie it into what you were saying before, that after 9/11, certainly like Sikhs were treated as though they were speaking Arabic, right? When they're not. They're different cultures completely doing different things, but that's an external pressure as opposed to the internal pressure that you're describing in the book, with where your grandparents and your mother's generation were literally downplaying their own ethnicity as a result of this.
Yeah, I do think it is kind of unique. It kind of ties to respectability politics in a way, I think. This idea of, creating a persona that is very in line with what the white populace wants of us, which I sort of touch on as well with the model minority myth, which rose, post World War II in the sort of 60s, 70s, 80s. This idea that, Asians are the good minority, the smart minority, not making waves, which I think, as I touch on in the book, a lot of Japanese Americans were pleased with, because after that sort of traumatic event, thinking, oh, now we're the good minority, now we're the ones that people like, which of course then adds to anti-Black sentiment in the 60s, et cetera. So it always has a backlash. And then again, of course, it has a backlash on our own community because of the distance that later generations feel from their own culture. So
do you, and I don't know if this is an appropriate question or not, so tell me that I should shut up. But do you think that the nature of dropping the atomic bomb on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, and the nature of the Japanese surrender as a result of that, plays into that cultural sort of erasure of your own culture?
I don't know exactly if it plays into specific erasure of culture. I think the tie there is I think that there was a very racist reason why we dropped the bomb on Japan rather than Europe. And I think that reason ties into the dehumanization of people of Japanese descent in America and abroad. And I think those two things really, you have to be able to dehumanize people in order to cause death on that mass scale.
Yeah.
So that's the tie-in. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, certainly, if you look at propaganda from that period of time, the Japanese are treated very, very differently than the Nazis. I mean, they're both bad, they're both the enemy, but the Japanese are in this non-human group in the way they're portrayed, and it's actually really horrifying when you look at it now.
Yeah, and that's why I think, and that kind of level of dehumanization didn't start with World War II. It started long before, like I said, with the Native Sons of the Golden West, with the alien, now I forget what exactly it's called, but immigration laws in the early 1900s that banned people from Asia, specifically because of these sort of racist policies and this idea of we don't want Asians coming in and replacing white people. There's a long process of dehumanization and villainization of people based on race that is necessary to get to the point where you are putting people in camps, where you are dropping atomic bombs on people. And that's why it's so important to know the context and to see, how we get from A to B, that it's never just a racist rhetoric. It's always leading up to these hugely traumatic moments.
Yeah. Well, and we, as the book deals with, as we can see today, it's happening today again, and it's horrifying to me that people are being fooled by these things that we've shouldn't we have learned the lesson now that demonizing the other human beings is not a way to move our society, and it's literally the opposite of what America proposes that it is, and that I certainly want to believe that it is. I want to believe that we're a great country that is trying to promote democracy and has freedom for all people, and all people are equal. I believe that in my heart of hearts, and yet there's this whole group of people who take it too far, or take it the wrong way, or I'm sure they're all nice people, but some of them are rapists. I can't believe that people fell for it in 2020.
And I think a big part of that is because we have glossed over our own history so thoroughly as a means of sort of patriotic, I guess, not wanting to have accountability in the name of patriotism, in the name of making sure that we were the superpower, and that we could become like the global standard for human rights. But in doing so, we have really, taken away tools that allow us to see things for what they are in the moment. Yeah.
Does it make it more difficult for you coming to these realizations to still have faith in America and what it is, or does it make you fight stronger for it?
I think that changes day by day.
Yeah.
Depending on sort of what I don't know, the mood of the day. But I think on the one hand, I know, in my brain, I know that America has never actually stood for these things. That from the formation of it, it was always built upon capitalism and white supremacy in huge ways, and that I'm not always sure that that can be reclaimed in a way that is actually just. But in my heart, again, like you said, in my heart, I think, wouldn't it be nice if it could be?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
I don't know. I think the foundation of the country is rotten, but I do think that there are people, fighting every day to figure out a way to build something on it.
Yeah. And if there's any hope that I have, and I mean, this is a futile and pointless hope in a way, but that the horror of the moment is going to propel us into making the future better.
I would hope, yeah.
That's my hope, right? Like that. My hope is that the it's going to be a blue wave, and we're going to sweep it clean, and we're going to actually put in some structural changes that will still not be enough, right? Like we'll still need to go many, many, many miles more, but that we can start to put in these structural changes to start making things fairer and more parity and that. Do you have an opinion? Are Japanese Americans owed some sort of recompense from the government for having their lives uprooted, being tossed in camps, having their property taken away?
Actually, they got that in the 80s.
Okay.
Reagan, there were reparations made.
Was it enough, though, do you think? I guess, do we need more?
On the one hand, my family didn't get it because my mom and grandparents my grandmother and great-grandparents had already died. And so descendants didn't get anything. It was only if you were directly impacted.
Right.
But I also think it is a very strange thing to have reparations for Japanese Americans before having reparations for slavery, which is still a conversation that is, being had, but also being dismissed so easily. And again, it is an issue of economics. It is because there were so many fewer survivors at camp in the 80s. That was 40 years later. It was economically feasible for them to make this sort of token gesture. And they don't think that it's economically feasible to have reparations for descendants of slaves. It makes it feel very hollow. So I don't think reparations are the answer for Japanese American incarceration. It doesn't fix it, especially when the administration now is able to, on TV, say, Japanese American incarceration is a precedent for putting people into camps. Like, if you were able to just go out and say that, then reparations mean nothing.
Right. Well, that's what I'm saying. We didn't learn our lesson, and unlike as I said, I never learned anything about the camps when I was growing up, but certainly we learned about slavery, and so I wonder if we just haven't reckoned culturally with this at all, because we're basically ignoring it and putting blinders on, for example, I hadn't realized that Tanforan Racing Track, which I think is now a mall.
It is a mall. Yeah.
I didn't know that was, sort of the staging ground, and I had no idea. I mean, obviously they had to be taken someplace, but I didn't realize, and I'm reasonably confident that there's nothing at the Tanforan Mall of a little memorial or a plaque or something that says, on this space, 50,000 people were taken away. We without those things, how do we begin to reckon with this as a society?
Yeah, that is true. That's another example of something being torn down and replaced by a mall in the story. I think there might be a plaque across the street from the mall. But I don't remember, and it certainly isn't prominent. There's much more there's much more at the mall about the horses than there are about the people that were there.
Right.
But yeah, I think that is a huge part of American culture, and we're seeing a lot of that now with the sort of tearing down of these Confederate statues that were built during the Jim Crow era. What we choose to memorialize, what we choose to remember is so specific and so targeted. An entire country is built over, the civilizations that we committed genocide upon, and have little to no recognition of the people that lived here before. So I think that is a very typical thing for us to do. And again, the fact that it's a mall, it's just so on the nose. This country is built on this sort of capitalist erasure of culture and of people. It's very on the nose.
Yeah. Well, I don't know what to say with that.
I'm sorry, it's a depressing.
No, it's all good. It's all good. I just I don't know how to follow that one up. So I will ask Jordan if there's any other questions come through, because I see. Well, I mean, let's put up the questions and we'll see. Pick something. See what you think. How difficult was it for you to jump into the business aspects of comics, getting your comic out into our hands from getting a publisher, publicity, etc.? I think that's actually an excellent question.
Yeah. Speaking of capitalism, I was lucky enough that I was able to work with First Second, which is a really great publisher, and has done a really remarkable job of making it easy for me to not have to deal with the marketing end of things, because I'm very bad at that. Right. So I felt very lucky that I was able to mostly focus on the art, because I had a publisher that was really behind me and supported me, and put the marketing part, had a really great marketing team that did that job for me. So in terms of early on, I think the process of sort of working up towards pitching to an actual publisher, it started very much at cons, and I'm very sad that cons are kind of up in the air in terms of how we're going to be doing them in the future, because they were a huge part of sort of meeting people, building up a base of people who had seen my comics at cons, and who I therefore had the emails to actually contact people about when I had an actual book idea. So yeah, I'm really hopeful that cons come back in some way, because I really think, especially now that graphic novels are becoming more and more of an industry that is making money for people, editors will go around to cons and sort of see artists that they can create a relationship with. Sure. So that's sort of where I started.
Sure. Well, let's. So this kind of gets back to stuff I was trying to earlier tease out of you. How did you put together that initial pitch? Right. So you knew what you wanted in your mind. So what kind of a pitch did you put together? How long was it? What did it contain? How many publishers did you pitch it to?
Yeah, I initially pitched it to one publisher that ended up going in a different direction, and so then I was able to contact First Second. And initially it was basically, I think it was a 2-page outline and just a few like character sketches. And I think I also drew a row house, which ended up not, being relevant necessarily to the overall story. But yeah, it was basically just a 2-page little outline summary at the top of what the book would try to achieve, and then sort of like a basic outline and some character sketches. And I really think, I think at least, that more than the specifics of the outline, it was sort of the relationship that I had with people that I was emailing based on interactions that we'd had at cons and the work that they'd seen from me before. So doing anthologies, doing short comics and stuff at first, I think really helped me find my footing in that.
I mean, I thoroughly agree with you, but there's a hierarchy of how books are acquired, that when you have an editor that's simpatico with you, they still have to go up the chain to their boss and show them, here's the physical document that they sent me. Can I put this in my budget? You know, there's approvals involved in that. So you didn't have any sample art pages or anything, or
I believe I did have some sample art.
okay.
I don't remember if it was a full page or just panels. And now it's been almost 4 years, so
Sure,
I don't remember a lot of it. But yeah, I think I did have at least a sample page, definitely some sample character designs. Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't remember a lot of that part.
That's all fine. That's all fine. So when they approved the book and they said, yes, you may do a book, what did you do then? Other than a happy dance?
Yeah. Then I was still working at my day job at that point, which was I was a very low level, like hourly tech person at Google Maps. So what I did then was use my lunch hour to write the script over the course of a few weeks, months, sort of try to figure out how the script was going to go. And alongside that, drew sort of the thumbnails that would eventually become the final thumbnails. But at the time, they were just margin sketches of how I wanted pages to look. Okay. And it went through the process of sort of figuring out, the structure of the chapters and, specifically where I wanted my characters to go, not just in camp, but also like emotionally.
Yeah. So it was words first, just words first.
Yeah, words and then drawings in the margins, I think were helpful. Sort of planning out the page structure by drawing it sort of on the side.
Yeah. And were you drawing those thumbnails for each and every page, or were you just sort of hitting specific scenes?
For the most part, it was every page, and it would be generous to even call them thumbnails. A lot of the time, it was really just like three shapes. Like, how did I want the page to sort of be laid out in the most basic way? And then I kind of trusted myself to remember how that was going to actually come together, which,
Looks like we have another question. Put it up, Jordan. Padrigo again. Hello, Padrigo. I love how you draw interesting characters within your crowds. It makes me stop and think of all the stories within. Did you draw from photo reference?
Oh, yeah. Actually, it depended on the crowd scene. Sometimes it was really just random drawings. Other times, like I think at the funeral scene and the final theater scene as well, I tried to put in little Easter eggs. So Octavia Butler is in the theater in New York. And at the funeral scene, I actually included a man named Jiro Onuma. Oh, sorry, I'm going to look up his name. Jiro Onuma, I think it is. Yes, Jiro Onuma, who was pretty much the only documented gay man in camp, like the only one that we have real documentation of. Right. Because there is an LGBT relationship, a gay relationship in my book, I really wanted to give a nod to the historical precedent that he sort of set as being the only really concrete documentation we have of LGBT representation in camp.
Yeah. Interesting. So you've written a script. Your editor is going over the script with you at this point, or have you not yet involved an editor?
Yeah, no, the editor, my editors, I had Callista Brill and also Whit Taylor, who were really helpful in sort of, and Whit was more in the later stages helping me figure out the actual structure of the story, and she was just absolutely great. So definitely relied on editors to sort of help me figure out the pacing and making sure that everything flowed well enough. Again, this is the longest thing I've ever written, so that was hugely challenging at first to pace it, to figure out, how to fit everything in without being too wordy or without, having too many long moments of silence, which I think I tend to include. So yeah, working with Whit on the script throughout.
Yeah. How long did the writing process take you?
Oh man, I wish I could remember exactly. Yeah.
Roughly. You don't have to be
It took months for sure. It took a while. And there were various stages of, first draft, second draft, and it took its time. I don't remember exactly how long, but everything in the book took much longer than I thought it would, basically.
Yeah. How many drafts did you go through, do you think?
I think there were about 5 versions of the script by the end.
Wow.
Yeah.
And did it change dramatically from the first to the fifth, or are they sort of process changes?
Oh man, I think there were the overall structure was basically the same, but I think there were dramatic changes in certain parts. And I wish I could think of a concrete example, but certainly clarifying the structure of the story and the pacing was a big issue and a big one that Whit Taylor really helped me with.
Yeah.
But they were also very, I think, forgiving and gave me a lot of leeway in terms of how I wanted to tell the story and the things I wanted to include, which I was really grateful for. There wasn't much pushback at all about various things. Like I didn't think that they would allow me to include a gay relationship in the book, especially because it's a historical book and it's hard to find historical books that feature LGBT relationships.
Yeah.
But yeah, they were great. They really gave me a lot of freedom in that respect, creatively.
Yeah. I would actually be surprised if it was different personally, but so were you drawing anything during this, sort of 5 drafts process, or was it sort of a separate step for you? Because different people approach it in different ways.
Yeah. In terms of drawing for the book or drawing other projects?
Yeah, drawing for the book.
Yeah.
Drawing pages for the book. Yeah.
Yeah. I definitely started with character designs was the big one for me because I wanted to really make the characters real as I was writing them. So figuring out how to draw myself was a big step, figuring out how to draw my grandmother. And then, the various characters that I was creating, how to give them life and personality and make them distinct enough that readers could easily recognize them. So character designs was a huge one. I also drew the first chapter pretty early on as like a style test to sort of figure out how I wanted to draw things and how long it was going to take. So yeah, I definitely started drawing early on, and then I took a break while I was writing, and then I just had to draw it all again.
So the first chapter in San Francisco, all that you actually drew early on.
Yeah, a lot of it. Yeah.
Is it more or less the final version that appears in the book, or did that go through substantial changes as well?
It's pretty much the final version, and you might notice there is more shading on that part than the rest of the book because I thought I would have more time.
Right.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
So, yeah, the little things like that where at first I was so ambitious, and then I realized this is a whole book. I have to really pare it down.
Right. Once you started drawing, did you still have your Google job at that point, or?
Yes, at the beginning I did. Yeah. So, and I don't feel too bad about it, admitting how much time I spent taking breaks and actually going to draw in the break room.
Right.
It's a major corporation. They can take the loss.
Yeah. Did you, so I guess this brings a very natural next question. Do you work digitally or do you work pen and paper? What's your process?
I definitely work mostly digitally. The thumbnails, I like to do pen and paper, especially when I like to print out the script and then sort of draw on the margins and figure out the thumbnails on that way. But everything else was digital, and that is mainly because it's mobile, and again, I could do it at work, and overall a little less expensive because I don't have to buy all the supplies.
Yeah, I mean, were you working at work like on a big Wacom table or tablet?
I had the Intuos. Yeah, at the time I had the Intuos. I actually got a Cintiq only after I was like, okay, now I have to draw a book, so I'm gonna invest in this.
Yeah. That seems like a pretty hefty thing to carry back and forth to work, though. No?
Yeah, I just had it in a backpack.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Um uh how soon after did you stop working? I assume you quit?
Yeah. And it was actually not even because I wanted to work on the book full time. It was
Oh,
structural changes at Google that was happening. Yeah. So I think I was there throughout the writing process and like the very beginning of the drawing process. And then I was like, you know what? I'm just gonna focus on this. And yeah, Google
and
is doing
did
their
you
own thing.
essentially go full time at that point? Were you
Yeah.
like 7 days a week, or were you having a more balanced schedule?
I was not very good at balancing it. No, it was definitely more of like, all right, I'm going to do it in bursts, and then I would burn myself out, and then have to take a break, and then do it in bursts again. Not the
Right.
healthiest work situation. I figured it
Yeah.
out a little bit more as I went, but at first it was not great.
Well, as I say, I mean, to go from sort of the structure of doing 30-page stories to doing a 300-page story, those are very, very different things. Those are very,
Yeah,
very different things.
yeah,
And one thing that I consistently hear from cartoonists all the time is sort of sustaining that creative effort, over the course of anywhere from 6 months to, in your case, 4 years, is can be challenging. It can be one of the biggest challenges, in fact.
yeah, and it can be very demoralizing to see, oh, I feel accomplished. I've drawn these many pages, but now I've got 100 pages left. How is that possible?
Right, right, right.
um, yeah, yeah, that was I think a big part of the challenge of drawing a whole book is really the mental difficulty of facing down all these pages.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and I wonder too, like in terms of the creative weight of it, how it is for you. Of you've written a script, and so you've created something, right? It's not the final product yet, but you have done, let's say, a significant part of the heavy lifting. Then you've got to go in and do all the detail work. So was that a challenge for you to handle that, to handle the second step, essentially?
yeah. It was actually, I think at times it was the challenge, but at other times it was much more rewarding because I don't necessarily consider myself much of a writer. I'm usually focusing on the art. So to be able to see the page and actually finish a page felt a lot more like an accomplishment than to write a page, even though, as you say, it is writing a whole book. But it visually appeals to my sense of completion more when I see it when I see it drawn,
Yeah,
I guess. So
yeah,
I was excited to get to the point where I was inking, especially
sure.
when it started to actually look like a real book. And I was like, okay, this isn't just, things on a page. This is going to be something.
Yeah.
So yeah, getting from script to inks, I think, is the biggest challenge for me.
So I'm interested, always with people who work digitally. What do you really see as the difference between sort of the penciling and the inking? Because I've spoken to people who it all blurs together. It's kind of one step, because you're essentially can ink at the time you're laying out. And since you can remove stuff so easily and redraw and then just plop it into the art, then it makes it harder to differentiate between the two. Is that true for you, or is it different for you? How is your process like?
Yeah, I think my inking style, I have a style that is very reliant on sort of fluid, singular lines.
Mm.
So I actually find a big difference between pencils and inking. Or pencils, I allow myself to have much more freedom of just sort of scribbling a lot of different jagged lines. But I'm not able to translate that to inks. So my inking is usually a lot different than the pencils. Yeah. And
Yeah,
I am very jealous of people who manage to make their sort of pencils look really nice
right,
because
right.
mine don't.
Yeah, yeah. No, it's fascinating with comics too, because there's a million ways to do it. I've interviewed
Right.
150 cartoonists, and I think I've heard 150 different answers, I think, about
Yeah.
how you create, which is fantastic when you think about it. It's not a font based on your handwriting. It's just a regular computer font. Did you lay out your own lettering, or did First Second help with that? What was your lettering process?
I did lay out most of the lettering, but I had a lot of help from the book designer, Molly Johnson. Shout out to book designers who are doing incredible work.
Yep.
Yeah. So lettering is probably my least favorite part. So I was very glad to have some help with that. I mostly just sort of put the text in as I could, and then Molly really helped me arrange it and figure out how to make it legible and look okay. So.
Sure, right. And the big trick with comics is always how do you get the eye to flow on the page?
Yeah.
How do you, because you can ruin a page of comics if you put the balloon in the wrong place, and all of a sudden your eye is like, wait, why do I have to go over there? Or
yeah.
Figure out. Are you doing the lettering sort of as the sort of traditional way you do comics is you pencil, then you letter, then you ink? Is that the same with how you were working?
Yeah, pretty much. And I definitely would have to make changes as I went, because a lot of times when I would have my pencils, I would go into inks and think, wait a minute, I want this to look a little different. So I would have to make some changes at that point. But yeah, I found it helpful to have the blocks of text there while I was drawing to make sure I left enough space.
And then coloring. You did your own coloring, I'm assuming, yeah? Because there's no
Yeah,
one else.
and that's one of the things that I learned as I was working. I was like, wait a minute, people hire people to do the flat colors. I should think about that. And then I never did.
Right.
Yeah.
I like your palette a lot. You have a very sort of muted pastels, and I think that they really help the story along.
Thank you.
Where how much thought did you put into your palette ahead of time versus kind of just let me just start coloring pages?
Definitely, I had to do a lot of testing, and it was a frustrating part, the initial part, to really figure out what colors I was going to use. I was able to visit Topaz actually in the process of sort of early writing the book. So Topaz is in a place called Delta, Utah, or just outside of Delta, Utah, which is a part of Utah that is not very attractive. It is, very gray and very sagebrush, gray sand or dirt, and that's about it. There's not a lot of color. So going there and sort of experiencing that, I think was a big step in sort of figuring out what the palette was going to be. But I also knew I had to navigate it so it wasn't just gray on a page. So that was sort of a challenge. But yeah, I definitely going there and seeing the colors that existed there, the muted greens, the sky was the only real color, and then just sort of muted colors everywhere.
Yeah. What's Topaz like? Is it all still there? Is it just part of it? I'm super curious about this.
Yeah, it's really great that they were able to preserve a large part of it, and I think they're working on buying the rest because the area is not great for farming or anything. I don't think it was very appealing for people to snatch up when it was vacated. So luckily, a lot of it is still there, and I think the Boy Scouts even have made signs that sort of indicate what buildings would be where. So you can drive there and see the sort of like the foundations that have been left. You can see, there are areas where there's, still pottery on the ground and things like there's still remnants of what was there, which is pretty cool. And there's also a really great museum that opened up fairly recently in the last 5 years, I think, in Delta, Utah, that is within a 10-15 minute drive of the actual site, that tells a really great story and has really great exhibits. So
interesting. So the once you're getting rolling on the actual drawing of the book, how much are you producing a day? Are you doing a page a day? Are you doing less? Are you doing more?
Yeah, it definitely depended on the day, and the overall stage in burnout that I was. But I would definitely try to do, I would try to sit down and ink, 2 pages this day, 3 pages that day, take a break, and then sort of set overall like weekly goals of how many pages I wanted to make sure I got done. But yeah, I was not as consistent overall as I wish I could be. A large part of that is because I have chronic migraines, so that always threw things off. If I woke up and was like, well, I'm not getting anything done today.
Right.
Yeah. So on the one hand, it's nice to make your own schedule, but on the other hand, it definitely complicated things having that. Yeah.
Yeah. And like in terms of coloring, like what, how fast are you at something like that? I mean, you're doing like 5 pages a day when you were at that stage, or?
Oh, I think probably more like 3, maybe
Okay.
4. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it definitely depended on the page, because some pages there's just like one big landscape, and that was
Right.
very
Sure.
fast. Other
Yeah.
pages there's like 9 panels and the
Yeah.
cityscape, and I'm like, oh God.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very nice. Very nice. Yeah. I like this book a lot. I really did. I think, and particularly as a first novel, I think it's just an impressive piece of work that you
Thank
managed to
you.
pull off here, and you made me think, and you made me question some things, and you made me look at our own history here and find out new facts. And that's what comics excel at, is putting people into people's shoes in a way that I don't think other media really succeed in the same way, me personally. um
Thank
uh,
you.
do we have any other questions, Jordan? Are we through? Tell me what you got, man. It's all good. It's all good. Um, okay, he's got at least one more. Two more. All right. Oh, Raza, hello. You mentioned your step grandfather, but but I don't think you mentioned your grandfather, who seemingly left your mother with 4 kids. Was this also a very sad part of her life?
Yeah, that was definitely intentional. It was certainly not a great relationship, and another sort of, yeah, part of the history that I think, made it hard to talk about my grandmother's life. There were aspects of it that she didn't talk about, and that was certainly one of them.
Yeah.
But yeah, he was not particularly present in my mom's life. Yeah. And I actually don't even know if he went to camp. I'm not even sure.
Okay.
Yeah. But being, a single mom, who was Japanese American at the time in the 40s, 50s, 60s, again, that just added layers to it. There were not a lot of resources for her. And I think, that created even more issues.
Yeah. Well, she clearly did a good job raising you.
Oh,
you,
thank you.
you made this
I mean,
fantastic document. So
thank you.
yeah. Jordan's got another one. Let's go. Let's see what he got. Were Kiku's drawings in the book done digitally too? I think we just answered that one, didn't we? We did just
Yeah,
answer
it's all digital. Yeah, pretty
everything.
much.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very good. You got one more, Jordan, or no? Okay. The other thing, let me ask you is, were you aware of George Takei's They Call Us Enemy being a graphic novel, because it was released about a year before this came out?
Yeah, I don't know exactly how much I'm supposed to talk about it, but
Little as
yeah,
much as.
essentially, yeah. I mean, I essentially was originally pitching to Top Shelf IDW, and was told then, oh, actually, we're going to go with George Takei's book.
Right.
Yeah.
Which if you're going to get bumped for someone, getting bumped for George Takei seems okay.
Yeah, so I think we were pitching it around the same time, actually, which
Right.
I think, again, speaks to the fact that Japanese Americans were really trying to find a way to really be more outspoken in that time period. It was like
Sure.
specifically that moment where a lot of people were like, okay, now we talk about this.
Sure.
Yeah.
Have you been in contact with him at all?
No.
Just out of curiosity? Yeah.
No, I haven't. Never met him.
Well, I mean,
I
you've
don't
got an
know if
open
he's
Twitter
there.
account. It seems like it would be pretty easy to tweet at him and go, "I've got a copy of my book that, let me send you one." I bet he'd go, "Yeah," but yeah.
I have no idea. Yeah, I don't know. I didn't actually end up reading his because I didn't want to influence my own, so
Sure.
I haven't read it. But yeah, I have not heard from him or no.
Fair enough. Um, the last thing let me ask you is, and I think you'll have a good answer because you're relatively new at this. Someone, we got a lot of cartoonists watch this conversations, learn about cartooning, learn about how to start. A lot of wannabe cartoonists. So, what would be your advice to a new cartoonist starting out about how to approach comics or how to anything you want, any piece of advice?
Yeah, like I said, I started, comics, doing really short comics, and going to cons and just sort of selling short comics. And I think my advice would mainly be to really make the comics that you are excited about and that you are excited to make, and then figure out if that's going to be marketable later. Because I think if you were able to support yourself in other ways at first and really focus on putting your passion into the work that you make, that is always going to be a better way to advertise yourself than anything else. Because I think it creates the best work when you are writing and drawing things that you really care about and are really passionate about. So I was really lucky to have a job and be able to make comics as more of a passion at first, and then sort of think later about how to make money off of it. Because I think putting that passion into it and creating your own, I hate the word, but creating your brand and and the sort of artist you're marketing yourself as, making sure that is the art that you want to be making. Otherwise, you're going to be hired to do things that you kind of hate or don't feel passionate about.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree with everything that you said there. I think that makes a lot of sense. When you look at the fact that it took you 4 years from conception to execution, I have to imagine you whatever advance you got on the book is probably not enough to pay for 4 years worth
Yeah.
of your life. So I guess, was it worth it? And then sort of as the follow-up, do you see yourself doing comics full time going forward?
Yeah. So I was lucky enough. I had some savings from my job, and because I lived with my parents a little bit after college as well, I had a decent amount saved up that I was able to, once I did leave my job, that combined with the advance was able to sort of support me for a long time. And I was able to take some work at the same time as well. But certainly 4 years is not ideal for making one book. And a big part of that was so much of the initial phase was research. And I'm hoping at least that is very unique to this book, and that whatever I make in the future will not have necessarily that in-depth research phase that I was sort of committed to making it as accurate or as respectful as I could.
Sure.
So there was a lot of that front end time that really took to focus on research and writing that part, which future projects, which will not be as in-depth or historical, will not have to have as much sunk time into that. So yeah, I'm hoping to do comics full time.
Nice.
And to work on books that are a little bit less intense.
Yeah. Well, so that gives us the natural out question of what do you got in the pipeline? You got anything you can talk about? You got another book you can say coming up? What do you got?
I can't talk specifics,
Okay.
but I will say that the sort of sci-fi element that I include in Displacement is a nod to the fact that I really want to be doing more sci-fi, explicit sci-fi from here on out, because that's a genre very close to my heart.
Nice. Nice. Fantastic. Well, I mean, I think I can speak for everybody in the audience, certainly everybody here in the store. We'd love to see more work from you. I thought this was fantastic. Again, especially as a debut graphic novel, it is a work of much delicacy and thought and thoughtfulness, and things like this are things that I always am very happy to promote and put out there and get the word out about. And so if
Thank
you're
you.
sitting watching at home, and you're like, I got nothing to do, I'm sitting at home and I want to read a comic book, I really would recommend Displacement by Kiku Hughes. It's a smart, thoughtful, heartfelt science fiction book that tells us a lot of truths about ourselves and the moment that we're in, and it's thoughtful and it teaches you stuff, and that's fantastic. And so I want to thank you, Kiku, for making this book and for being part of this and being here today.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me as well, and for promoting comics as the beautiful art form that it is.
It's the greatest goddamn thing in the universe. Let me say that on Sunday is the Kids Club. And on Sunday, we are talking to Tim Probert about Lightfall, the girl in the Galdurian, I think. This is also this guy can draw. Oh my, and oh man, this is a pretty book. Kids are gonna love this, but this is like one of those books that even as an adult I really loved it too. So that's really good. Next month's a regular adult graphic novel that's part of this club is Sacrifice of Darkness by Roxane Gay and Tracy Lynn Oliver, with Rebecca Kirby and James Fenner on art. We have at least 3 of those 4 coming in to talk to us next month. And then our classic graphic novel for next month will be Kingdom Come. That's like 2-3 weeks from now. We have a conversation with Mr. Mark Wade, which will probably be another long conversation about how comics get made. So that'll be fun. But our book this month, and which you should be reading, Displacement. All right. Thank you very much for watching. Thank you very much for listening, thinking about this book. We love you all very much, and we will talk to you next time.